Hello all, Rick here with a video that might seem redundant, but it's been on my mind ever since Lower Decks was first announced back in 2019. You see, I have one observation that has continued to linger in the back of my head tofu. That goes beyond simply how it looks. The series was going to be a comedy cartoon, and it was this more comical element that I was pondering, because the setting of Star Trek, the entire universe of science fiction that it sits in, can have its comedic moments for sure, but is it generally suited to comedy? The wacky events that the crew of the Cerritos find themselves in, the slipping in of Easter eggs, references, and disregard for the way things run in Starfleet, how would these work in relation to the larger mythology of Trek? First off, I want to lay some groundwork for my thought process, starting with how does the visual style of the cartoon translate into the real live action sets of other shows? If the USS Cerritos were to arrive next to the Enterprise E over a planet, how would that scene look if the crew was all live action? Well, Strange New Worlds of course provided a great deal of clarity on this topic, with its crossover episode in Season 2. But even before this, some elements are practically one-to-one recreations. While props, sets, outfits and uniforms might be stylised for the cartoonish look of the show, the same cannot be said for the starships. Several times we see existing vessels recreated in the animation of Lower Decks, but they are exactly as they appear in live action. Even the recreation of the Strange New Worlds intro scene in the animated style of Lower Decks shows us what details are omitted from the series that a live action show would display, but the shape, scale and overall look of a ship is maintained. When ships were implemented outside of Lower Decks 2, there were no changes to the designs, simply detailing being upgraded, such as hull Aztecing or the seams being shown. Out of everything seen, ships seem to be the easiest conversion. The California class in Lower Decks looks exactly like this in live action renders, maybe with some different hull diffractions based on different panels, like many other Starfleet ships. So that's easily answered. When it comes to people, well, that's a little more complicated, but from what we see in the live action appearances of Mariner and Boimler, they're played by their VAs, so I'm not really going to focus on physical appearances. After all, actors gonna act, and in theory all of these pikes should all look identical. What I do want to look at, however, is their mannerisms and the like. There are numerous jokes directed at the differences between cartoon and live action portrayals even in the show. Bookended jokes from Boimler about how realistic everything looks, and then the crew experiencing oddities in their appearance when downing alcoholic Orion hurricanes. Both of these are played off with the added context of disorientation or intoxication playing a factor to avoid a clear fourth wall break. But there are additional things that make me believe the differences in how Lower Decks shows things are exaggerated and might not be wholly accurate. Boimler does indeed shriek and flinch when startled. He does indeed have a comical power walk which he uses occasionally, and from when we witness him rewiring the Enterprise's station, he does seem to have poor spatial awareness and get himself tangled up. However, their dialogue between Mariner and Boimler is slower in live action, but definitely still reflective of their quick bickering. So this, coupled with the physical comedy being present but toned down, because of course it is, it's live action, leads me to feel that what we see in Lower Decks is an exaggeration of real-life events. The overly exuberant mannerisms displayed by Riker can be another example, as he has appeared in both cartoon and live-action forms, so the differences are there to see too. What about items, outfits and scenery in the show? Once again, we can look at the things that have appeared in both live-action and the cartoon, and I'm going to start with the uniforms. Lower Decks introduced a second uniform that was in circulation during the early 2380s that was in operation alongside the Dominion War era uniforms, which also appeared. And right off the bat we can see the biggest difference is in the level of detail. The grey shoulders of the war era ones have this almost cartridge pleat texture which is missing in the cartoon depiction. It is the same with dress uniforms. When the Lower Decks uniforms enters into live action, however, it's basically unaltered except for one detail: the badge. The Delta symbol in Lower Decks is plain, unadorned silver, but in live action we see it has a darker rim around it, even if it still has the plain silver surface and no backing plate. So, much as with these ships, we can assume that most of the props and clothing seen would translate to live action with a higher level of detail, but proportionally the same. The phasers, therefore, are likely to not be exact replicas of the ones seen in First Contact, but yet another model that is stockier and wider, although in the same style as others of the era. This looks to be the same story with the set design, as we see on DS9 and other familiar technology such as a holodeck, simply with some detailing lost. It might seem obvious to suggest that the cartoon is merely a simplification while being an exaggeration of real life, but if the animations and portrayals of physical characteristics are overstated, what else could be? Are events in the show actually canon? Well, yes, because the powers behind Trek say so, but does that mean that events unfolded 100% as seen? I'm not so sure. The sheer level of coincidence that would need to occur to allow for all these comedic events to happen to the same ship and crew would be astronomical, so for the sake of my own headcanon and attaching it to the wider universe of Trek, I believe what happens on screen is canon in the event, but perhaps not as exaggerated or over the top as these caricatures might make it seem. The events of Lower Decks add a fair amount to the overall lore of the universe, so it seems unwise to write it all off as non-canonical, purely because it's a fun cartoon. We get things like the first introduction of the Lunar class on screen, the fate of Nick Lucano, a rising threat from the Packlids, and so much more. While not canonical, there is a cameo from a Lower Decks crew member in the Star Trek Godshock series of comics featuring Captain Sisko in 2378. That is Lieutenant Shaxs Drazon. Kira introduced him to Sisko, referring to their time in the resistance against Cardassia, and describes him as a hell of a soldier and a damn good officer. While on the Cerritos, he is loud, brash, and wears his emotions on his sleeve. In this more grounded depiction, he is initially more official and, dare I say it, reserved. No exaggerated swinging of arms, no shouting, but the dialogue is still as security focused as he ever is. However, it doesn't take long before he is exclaiming in joy at forcing a Cardassian ship into retreat, and being talked down by Data into not escalating an incident into a diplomatic war. Shaxs expresses excitement at the prospect of engaging a Romulan in melee combat, an experience he's never had before, while relishing the chance to battle Cardassians and holding the religion of the prophets in high esteem. In his downtime too, we see that he is much more animated and vocal, more akin to his cartoonish appearance in Lower Decks, so clearly this is a personality trait of his. In light of this depiction in the comics, again, I find it highly suggestive that what we are seeing in the show is simply these characters and events, just dialed up to 11 in the retelling. What do you think? Of course, this style of Lower Decks is not reflective of how things, quotes, actually look, but I think this applies in a minor way to the events of the show too. What we see is an exaggerated version of events, as if it's being retold to us in a deliberately comedic lens. I'm reminded of a quote from Rick Byrne. Star Trek is not contemporary, it's a period piece, and even though it's a period piece in the future as opposed to a period piece in the past, it still necessitates a certain style of acting and writing that is not contemporary. Lower Decks, for as much as I love it, certainly feels like it has this modern comedic veneer over it, which doesn't seem as present when aspects of it are removed from that specific show. I think it all relies on the personal internalisation of the show, and it's going to be different for everyone. Honestly, this topic started as just a look into Lower Decks' events and their implications on the wider canon, but quickly escalated into a wider interpretation of Lower Decks' style. Roddenberry himself is often quoted as saying that the Klingon redesign never happened in the lore, but then DS9 made an in-universe observation and Enterprise dedicated a whole arc to explaining it. Lower Decks does not go that far, but it's a question in a similar vein, I think. So, thanks for watching this analysis of Lower Decks' look and feel. I guess that's what this video was, and that's the conclusion I came up with. I've been Rick, and I'll see you again later for another video. Until then, goodbye.